In our last unit, we looked at how the Roaring Twenties were defined by a wave of prosperity that followed World War I. The mass consumerism, as well as the cultural ties such as baseball and the American radio, defined the culture of the 1920s. Today, we'll be looking at other cultural elements of the Roaring Twenties. Specifically, we'll look at how this decade was also defined by competing conservative and liberal values. Okay, in this unit, we'll look specifically at those conservative values, how the prosperity that followed World War I was promoted and championed capitalism over communism, that the men returning from World War I resumed their place in the factory and in the storefront, while women returned to the home, and that a wave of nativism and national pride pushed American immigration to create the first set of highly restrictive immigration laws. Next, we'll look at the competing values of fundamentalism, conservative social values that are faith-based, competing with the new, less parochial values of the modernist age. And finally, we'll look at the conservative experiment of prohibition and how that defined the 1920s. While we saw that the protections and advancements of labor through World War I continued to improve, the consequences of anti-war actions on the behalf of radical labor parties like the International World Workers, or the Wobblies, as well as the Bolshevik movement in Russia, tainted American opinion about the labor movement, as well as the politics of socialism and communism. Following World War I, the first Red Scare takes place. In the United States, a small communist party had emerged, and those people were blamed for the labor strikes that had taken place during and shortly after the war. For example, the labor disruption in Seattle in 1919. The first Red Scare was initiated when the federal government appointed Attorney General Mitchell Palmer to investigate the influence of communism within the United States political system. Now, this is not the most famous Red Scare. Keep in mind, after World War II, a second and probably more significant Red Scare takes place and is investigated by the United States Congress, most significantly by Senator Joseph McCarthy. This smaller yet significant Red Scare was also championed by an ambitious bureaucrat. Palmer rounded up over 6,000 suspects nationwide. Many of the people that were accused of being communists or anarchists were rounded up and actually shipped back to Europe. One notable example of this was the December 1919 departure of the USS Buford, nicknamed the Soviet Ark, that hauled 250 alleged communists back to Russia. In September of 1920, another bomb blasted Americans and their conscience against communism. This time in America's economic center, Wall Street. This bomb killed 38 people and wounded hundreds of others. This picture is a photograph of the bomb blast on Wall Street. The target of the terrorist attack seemed to be the offices of J.P. Morgan. In the background, you can see a statue of George Washington. That's Federal Hall, where George Washington was inaugurated in the first presidential inauguration under the U.S. Constitution. States responded to the anti-red hysteria by passing criminal syndicalism laws, which basically outlawed even the figurative advocacy of violence in favor of social change. This particularly was impactful on not only anarchists and communists, but also more radical labor unions like the Wobblies. Conservatives used the Red Scare to break up unions, and a push for open shops as opposed to closed shops became the American plan. As a reminder of what the difference is between an open shop and a closed shop, during the Progressive era, people like Samuel Gompers had pushed for a closed shop environment that would only hire labor union workers. In this case, the backlash, the American plan, and the open shop would allow for laborers or for factories to hire anyone regardless of their association with a labor union. Without exception, the most high-profile and controversial example of anti-Redism and anti-foreignism of the 1920s was the murder trial of Nicholas Sacco and Bartholomew Vanzetti. On April 15th, which isn't too far away from today, 1920, a paymaster for a shoe company in Massachusetts was shot and killed along with a guard as they transferred the evening's payroll into a safe. The murderers, who were described as two Italian men, escaped with more than $15,000. After going to a garage to claim a car that the police said was connected with the crime, Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested and charged with it. Although both men carried guns and made false statements upon their arrest, neither had a previous criminal record. On July 14, 1921, they were convicted and sentenced to die. The trial was defined by jury and judge prejudice against the defenders because of their Italian ancestry and their association with atheist, anarchist, and anti-war sentiments. The case dragged on for over 6 years until 1917, when the men were condemned to die by the electric chair. Despite limited physical evidence, as well as calls from around the world to retry Sacco and Vanzetti, the state Supreme Court of Massachusetts refused to upset the verdict. And on August 23rd, Sacco and Vanzetti were electrocuted. What's interesting about the legacy of Sacco and Vanzetti is that they became martyrs within communist and socialist societies as examples of the kind of excess and prejudice that the United States and capitalist societies had against working men. Now, the issue over Sacco and Vanzetti's guilt was to remain a mystery until the 1960s, when modern forensics provided some insight into the innocence and guilt of these men. In 1961, a test of Sacco's gun using modern forensics apparently did prove that it was his gun that killed the guard, though little evidence has been found to substantiate that Vanzetti had anything to do with the affair. In 1977, Massachusetts governor and presidential candidate Michael Dukakis issued a proclamation vindicating the two men. Sacco and Vanzetti also became the muse of folk singers Joan Baez as well as Woody Guthrie in two songs that were written in the 1960s and became anthems of anti-government attitudes. While you may not like the music, you should listen to these songs to hear how those ballads really shape the story and the perspective about the establishment versus the underclass. As we've discussed, the 1920s saw the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan, amongst other ultra-conservative uprisings. We've discussed how the movie Birth of a Nation reinvigorated an interest in the hidden society of the Klan. By the mid-1920s, 5 million due-paying members including members of the US government and state governments, belonged to the Klan membership. Now, this didn't last very long, and the Klan that you think of when you think of the 1950s and 60s during the Civil Rights era is the second reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan that was reestablished in the 1920s eventually fell away because of corruption and racketeering on behalf of the Klan's administration. Anti-foreignism, segregationist, and ultra-conservative groups sprung up, especially in the Midwest and throughout the Bible Belt of the South. Really, the Klan didn't so much reflect the same priorities as the founders did in the 1860s, but more of the anti-foreign nativist sentiments of the 1850s. The Klan of the 1920s was anti-foreigner, anti-Catholic, anti-Black, anti-Jewish, anti-pacifist, anti-communist, anti-internationalist, anti-evolutionist, anti-bootlegger, anti-gambler, anti-progressive, and pro-Anglo-Saxon, pro-Native American, as in nativist American, and pro-Protestant. The Klan was also anti-feminist. Here we can see Klanswomen on parade in 1928. Klan women were opposed to suffrage and the progressive movements that involved birth control and a greater role of women outside of the home. Instead, here women members, unmasked and unapologetic, marched down Pennsylvania Avenue outside of the White House in support of traditional conservative American values. But anti-foreignism was not merely a thing of the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, it became mainstream politics. America, as it returned from World War I, recoiled at the flood of immigrants that were coming into the country and challenging the availability of good-paying jobs for white Native American citizens. In this case, most of the immigrants that were part of this new immigration of the 19-teens came from Southern and Eastern Europe, many of them carrying with them a support for labor unions and socialist or progressive politics. So we see the first major immigration reforms take place in the 1920s. The first being the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, and I want to emphasize the fact that they called it an emergency quota. And the second being the Immigration Act of 1924. So what a quota is it sets a cap, a maximum number of entries coming into the United States from any given region or nation in the world. And that first legislation, the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, set that number at a low 3% of the number of entries coming from whatever region of the world came in the year 1910. Even more extreme, the Immigration Act of 1924 reduced the number of entrants into the United States to 2% of the 1890s entries. Now, this is especially important with Asian Americans because if you recall, the very first Immigration Act passed by the United States Congress was the Japanese Exclusion Act. So there literally was no immigration from Japan in the year 1890, which meant that the United States was accepting 2% of zero Japanese immigrants moving forward into 1924. So this slams the door shut on immigration from countries that the United States had deemed as undesirable. We hung on the Statue of Liberty, not literally, but figuratively, a no vacancy sign. This political cartoon, which is entitled "The Only Way to Handle It," reflects isolationist and nativist attitudes. reducing the flow of immigrants to the United States in the 1920s. This really did pivot away from the American policy that had brought 35 million Americans into the country in the 1890s through the 19 teens, exchanging in place of it basically a small trickle of immigration from Northern and Western European countries. For our third element of conservatism, I want to discuss about the conflict between traditional fundamental Christian conservative values within the United States and developing more secular modernist philosophies in general. And no better example of how fundamentalism continued to shape American systems than that of the Scopes monkey trial. Here we see a clash between theology and biology in the classroom. By 1925, about a quarter of US children were graduating from high school, and they were being taught by professional educators like John T. Scopes. In 1925, Scopes was charged with violating Tennessee's anti-evolution state statute, which prevented teachers from teaching evolution inside of a public high school. Inside of a public high school. Now, Scopes had intentionally challenged this law with the support of the American Civil Liberties Union, and the trial became this public spectacle that was basically orchestrated between two immensely famous attorneys. Legendary defense attorney Clarence Darrow, who defended John Scopes, and the populist politician, who you're familiar with his name, William Jennings Bryan, who was the chief prosecutor for the state of Tennessee. So the reason why the Scopes trial is also known as the monkey trial is because Bryan cross-examined a monkey as one of his key witnesses in demonstrating that humans did not evolve from apes. So he put this monkey up on the stand and asked it questions to demonstrate that a monkey is nowhere near the same kind of sophisticated and intelligently designed being as a human. Furthermore, Bryan also took the stand himself as a professional of the Bible and defended what he said was the literal nature of the Holy Gospel. And so when Darrow cross-examined Bryan about stories such as Jonah and the whale and the creation story, it was up to Bryan to defend that what was written in the Bible is literally true. Now, opinions about the success of both sides vary depending on a person's religious convictions, but Darrow worked Bryan into a tizzy. And in fact, he was so worked up about this particular trial, which took place in the middle of summer and was incredibly hot, that by the end of the trial, William Jennings Bryan suffered from exhaustion and a stroke and died shortly thereafter. But as for the outcome of the trial, Scopes was found guilty in pretty short order by the Tennessee jury and fined $100. Now, eventually the Tennessee Supreme Court suspended the fine, but upheld the court's order. And it really just goes to demonstrate how something as natural or as common as we see evolution taught in high schools today was a controversial and politically challenged notion during the 1920s. And so fundamentalism wins a hollow victory, and this force continues to be the center of American spirituality through the next couple of decades. The last major conservative movement that we have to talk about here was the experiment of prohibition. Now, we've already covered what was motivated or what the motivations of prohibition were. We have the women's rights movement and how women felt, especially the consequences of alcoholism and domestic violence associated with that. We've seen how the anti-German or anti-European nativist movement fed into this push for prohibition because of how immigrant communities were associated with consumption of alcohol and the use of saloons. And we've also seen how a lack of regulation on consumption of alcohol led to serious social ills in the workplace, as well as especially in inner cities. And so America and progressive roots of trying to improve society through legislation take on this grand experiment of the 18th Amendment. And the 18th Amendment, which is the only amendment to reduce American liberties as opposed to increase them, is enforced through the congressional law known as the Volstead Act, which basically prohibits the consumption, distribution, and production of alcohol. So while the 18th Amendment gives Congress the right to restrict all of those things, the Volstead Act is the teeth, is the actual legislation that carries out the 18th Amendment. But the push for prohibition really came from two regions of the country, the West and the South, where in the West, the consequences of unruliness in the Wild West, the prostitution, the gambling, the public drunkenness, was met with the need for government response. And then the South, with the more conservative traditional values, coupled with the fear that poor whites and emancipated African Americans would wreak havoc on society when they were consuming alcohol, led to a push for its prohibition. The biggest opposition to prohibition would have come from eastern urban areas with high immigration or high immigrant populations. Foreign-born people found community and found political activism within the saloon. By and large, Americans were pretty tolerant of prohibition, and it might have been a success if the United States had done a better job of actually carrying this out. And the first step towards enforcement of any law is having sufficient federal agency to act as law enforcement. We're seeing this oftentimes with marijuana. States such as Colorado, Washington, California, that have passed and legalized marijuana continue to violate federal law, but federal law enforcement is so spread thin that they're not going to take the time, waste the time to enforce federal law, especially if states are resistant to it. And so what we see with prohibition is that the agencies responsible for carrying out the Volstead Act are so spread thin that they're not going to be able to properly address people that distill moonshine for personal consumption, or people that purchase a bottle of liquor from a dealer for their own personal use. Instead, those federal agents are going to be focused on the mass production and distribution centers that are led by organized criminals. Now, I know a lot of times we think about the bootlegging industry as being people like Scarface, Al Capone, or any number of these colorful gangster figures that came out of urban centers like Chicago and New York. But the vast majority of bootlegged alcohol came from two places. First, personal or small scale moonshine distilleries, so bathtub gin. And number two, from our great neighbor in the north, Canada. We have the world's largest demilitarized border between the United States and Canada. And so running alcohol between our neighbor from the north down into less densely populated places in the Midwest was absolutely no problem. Furthermore, entrepreneurs figured out that on the coasts anyway, the easiest way to get illegal alcohol to their consumers was to hand it over to them in territory that the US government couldn't enforce its laws. So a lot of bootleggers purchased schooners or small ships, small boats, and distributed it in international waters. And so they found an easy way to get around the limited enforcement of prohibition. Now, what about these figures like Al Capone? Of course, prohibition led to corruption, and figures like Al Capone had large organized criminal syndicates that extended beyond prohibition. So they would pay bribery money to local law enforcement. They obviously use violence to eliminate their competition. And most notably in Chicago in the 1920s, we see a very bright rash of mob violence. I think in the 1920s, something like 500 mobsters were killed in turf wars. We get the birth of NASCAR as the birth of the automobile meets with the birth of organized crime and the use of the automobile and trying to soup up automobiles to transport alcohol or to try to transport bad guys away from the G-Man. We see that famous episode in history of organized crime and gangsterism and that type of thing. But really, the empires of people like Al Capone were built on a broad range of illegal activities and not just the distribution of illegal alcohol. We're talking prostitution, gambling, eventually the sales of drugs, and forcing people within their communities to pay protection money, racketeering money. And so it's through racketeering and other kinds of illegal means that organized crime during the 1920s booms to an $18 billion industry. Could that have been avoided if prohibition was not an experiment the United States went through? The answer to that is probably not. We still have organized crime. Organized crime will continue and develop wherever there is restrictions on people's ability to access a good or a commodity that they desire. And so it may have been reduced or it may have been transferred into some other arena. Certainly, prohibition gave fuel to this fire of illegal activity because all of a sudden America's desire for alcohol came at a higher price that organized criminals were willing to take advantage of. But in the end, prohibition wasn't entirely a failure. Okay. Um, families saved more money during the experiment of prohibition. We see fewer workplace injuries and fewer people taking time off from work, and public drunkenness reduces. Death and alcohol related injuries and deaths like liver cirrhosis steeply decline. And public reports on the consumption of alcohol drop as well. So America practices temperance during prohibition, and in all, it does help the health and welfare of the American people. Okay, so in our next unit, we are going to be discussing the counterside of the things we've talked about. We'll look at the continued role of multiculturalism and racial rights. We'll consider the changing progressive social values for women, as well as art and literature and music, and see that there is this modernist or contemporary pushback against the conservative values of the 1920s.